So in class we've been talking about the acquisition of Western territories, Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican-American War, things like that. And so the big question in terms of slavery is, with all this new territory, is that territory going to be slave or is it going to be free? And this is really the biggest question that leads us to the Civil War in terms of slavery, at least. And so what you're going to be looking at are several different events, really laws that are passed by the United States government to try to answer this question. The reason we have this question in the first place is the Constitution itself never says the word slavery. It mentions the Three-Fifths Compromise, but really does not address the slavery issue, and we talked about why that is. And so it's kind of up in the air. And so basically these events that you're going to be seeing is the United States attempt to answer this question of, should the new Western territories be slave or free? To set you up for what we're going to do in class in relation to this is, I'm going to set up a spectrum in class, north on the one side and south on the other, and for each one of these events we're going to put it onto the spectrum line in terms of, did it favor the North more, did it favor the South more, in terms of anti-slavery or pro-slavery. So that's what we're going to be doing in class. You can kind of think about that when you're looking at these different events. The first one we're going to look at actually applies to Missouri. And Missouri, at least the territory that is Missouri, was acquired as part of the Louisiana Purchase. And by 1820, Missouri wanted to become a state, and they actually wanted to enter the Union as a slave state. The problem with this is that there was an even balance at that time between slave states and free states. And so if Missouri entered, they would upset this balance of slave and free states. So Henry Clay, who we have mentioned before, becomes known as the Great Compromiser, and this is part of the reason why. He proposes a compromise where Missouri will enter the United States and become a state as a slave state. And to keep that balance, Maine, up in the northeast, would also enter, but they would enter as a free state, which would keep the balance the same between slave and free. The other key part of the Missouri Compromise was the line, the latitude line of 3630, which basically goes along the southern border of Missouri. And that was extended out westward, and this is really the first real decision on how the Western territories will be set up in terms of slave or free. And what that line said was, it extended west, and it said slavery could not exist north of that 3630 line. The next event we're going to look at has to do with some of the land that was acquired through the Mexican Cession and the Mexican-American War. And this deals mostly with California. And it actually, what it did was it proposed that California, as well as Utah and New Mexico, so basically most of what was the new southwest United States, would be closed to slavery forever, that slavery could never exist in these territories. The difference with the Wilmot Provisos and the other things we'll be looking at is it was actually never passed. It was passed by the House of Representatives, but then it was rejected by the Senate. So it was, more than anything, it's kind of a symbolic act. It never happened, but it showed the division between North and South. The South feared that if this was to pass, that it would have shifted power into the North. So it never actually took place, but it showed the opinions of both sides at that time in terms of what to do with the Western territories. Just a few years later, we have the Compromise of 1850, which also deals with California. California was very important at that time, mostly because of the gold rush, which we'll talk about in class, which starts in the late 1840s. And so California, before a lot of the other territories, wants to become a state, and they want to enter the Union as a free state. And this would obviously upset some of the issues of the Missouri Compromise, the 3630 line. Basically what comes out of the Compromise of 1850 is that California is admitted as a free state. To balance that, the slave trade well, the slave trade is also banned in the capital, that's Washington, D.C. But to balance that, the Fugitive Slave Act was solidified. This was an idea that had kind of gone back and forth in the past, and what the Fugitive Slave Act said was, if a slave ran away from the South into Northern Territory, Northerners actually had to help Southerners find the escaped slave. That was the Fugitive Slave Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a few years later and deals with just that. What was the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, or the Nebraska Territory? And it was divided between the two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and we have a new idea that develops here from Stephen Douglas, who was a senator from Illinois, and actually one of Abraham Lincoln's rivals. But he proposed a new idea called popular sovereignty, which basically says, throw out all the lines we've talked about before, the balance between slave states and free states, and basically just let the people decide in each new state and let them vote on if they want slavery or not. So it sounded like a fair idea to start. What they did not predict was what ended up happening in Kansas. This becomes known as Bleeding Kansas, and really is the foundation for the Missouri-Kansas rivalry that we are familiar with today. With Missouri being a slave state, Kansas had the chance to vote on what they wanted to do, and you had pro-slavery people from Missouri coming in, anti-slavery from people in Kansas, fighting and killing each other, and this becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. Finally, we have the Dred Scott case, and this is really the last big event in terms of the slavery issue and laws that we'll look at till we get to the outbreak of the Civil War. And we should also be familiar with this since it started in St. Louis, but what happened was Dred Scott was a slave, and he was taken north of the Missouri Compromise line. He was taken into free territory for a number of years, and he decided he was going to, because of this, sue for his freedom. And he initially went in St. Louis court, actually at the old courthouse, and his case is appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, and this becomes a Supreme Court case. It's Dred Scott versus Sanford, and this is maybe the most important of all. What the decision said was that, first of all, on the issue of slavery, first of all, they said Dred Scott could not sue because he was a slave and essentially not a citizen in the eyes of the court. But it also said that no territory could exclude slavery anywhere in the West. So the Missouri Compromise, popular sovereignty, all of those ideas are unconstitutional. There's no way you could limit slavery anywhere in the Western Territory. That's probably the most important part of the decision. And by saying that, it also stated that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, and the line, 3630 line, all that was unconstitutional. And they come to this conclusion, the Supreme Court does, basically by looking at the Fifth Amendment and people's right to property, and saying that slaves being property, people had that right and could extend that into Western Territory, and that's how the Supreme Court makes this decision. So your assignment with this PowerPoint is to go onto the blog, onto Edline, and to answer these two questions. You can give me your personal answer to these two questions, and then also I want you to respond to somebody else's. The other thing you can do to earn the points would be to comment on a question that you might have with this, and or possibly answer other people's questions that they have about this PowerPoint. If there's questions that don't get answered, we'll of course going to discuss this in class and make sure everything's on the same page before we go any further.